The air is thick, sweet, and slightly stinging. It's the smell of a trash can in mid-August, or perhaps the bottom of a fruit bowl you forgot to clear out before you left for vacation. Your nose wrinkles instinctively, but somewhere deeper in your brain, in the ancient, lizard-like basement of your consciousness, a tiny light turns on. That cloying, fermented scent triggers a specific, primal response. You might recognize it today as the sharp top note of a craft IPA or the heavy bouquet of a red wine, but for your ancestors, that smell was a dinner bell. It was the signal that a piece of fruit had fallen, sat in the tropical heat, and begun to transform. We have all experienced that strange, hazy warmth that follows the first few sips of a drink at a Friday night happy hour. You feel your shoulders drop, the tension in your jaw release, and suddenly, the person you're talking to seems significantly more interesting than they were 5 minutes ago. We call it a social lubricant. We treat it like a modern invention, a byproduct of our complex, stressful lives. But the truth is that you are participating in a biological ritual that is older than the human race itself. Before we had fire, before we had clothes, and long before we had the wheel, we had the buzz. We didn't choose this relationship. To understand why you can handle a glass of wine without ending up in the hospital, we have to look at a very specific moment in our evolutionary history. About 10 million years ago, the landscape of Africa was changing. The dense, lush forests were beginning to thin out, forcing our primate ancestors down from the safety of the canopy and onto the forest floor. Up in the trees, fruit was fresh, plentiful, and easy to find. On the ground, things were different. You had to take what you could get, and often what you could get was fruit that had been sitting there for a few days. In the heat of the Miocene epoch, that fruit didn't just rot, it fermented. Natural yeasts in the environment would find their way into the sugary flesh of a fallen mango or fig, converting those sugars into ethanol. For most animals, eating this was a mistake. Ethanol is technically a neurotoxin. It's meant to be a defense mechanism for the plant, a way to keep pests from eating the seeds. If a typical primate ate enough fermented fruit, it would become uncoordinated, slow, and easy prey for a passing leopard. But our ancestors hit an evolutionary jackpot. A single mutation changed everything. In 2014, a researcher named Matthew Kerrigan and his team at Santa Fe College conducted a study on the ADH4 gene. This is the gene responsible for producing the enzymes that break down alcohol in our systems. By resurrecting ancient proteins, Kerrigan's team discovered that roughly 10 million years ago, a common ancestor of humans, chimpanzees, and gorillas developed a mutation that made this enzyme 40 times more efficient at processing ethanol. This wasn't a random accident, it was a survival strategy. Suddenly, the fermented fruit on the forest floor wasn't a toxic waste product. It was a high-calorie food source that no one else could eat. If you could eat the rotten fruit and stay sober enough to climb back into a tree, you had an edge over every other species in the forest. You weren't getting drunk for the fun of it. You were getting drunk because it allowed you to survive a food shortage. We didn't learn to love alcohol. We evolved to tolerate it so we wouldn't starve. The forest floor was our first bar. This is what biologist Robert Dudley calls the drunken monkey hypothesis. He argues that our modern struggles with alcohol are essentially an evolutionary mismatch. Our brains are still wired to seek out that fermented scent because for millions of years, it pointed the way to the most calorie-dense meal in the jungle. When you smell a cocktail today, your brain isn't thinking about a hangover. It's thinking about survival. But there is a massive gap between accidentally eating a fermented fig and intentionally brewing a vat of beer. For a long time, the standard story in history books was that humans only started drinking once we became farmers. The logic was simple. You need a lot of extra grain to make booze, and you only have extra grain if you're growing it in fields. You settle down, you build a village, you plant some barley, and eventually, someone forgets a pot of porridge in the rain, it ferments, and eureka, civilization gets its first beer. It's a clean, logical story. It's also probably wrong. The archaeology suggests we were much more impatient. In 2018, a team led by Li Lu from Stanford University was excavating a site called Rakafet Cave in what is now modern-day Israel. This cave was a burial site for the Natufians, a group of hunter-gatherers who lived about 13,000 years ago. These people weren't farmers. They were still moving through the landscape, gathering wild grains and hunting gazelle. But inside that cave, carved directly into the stone floor, researchers found deep, cylindrical mortars. When they analyzed the microscopic residue inside those mortars, they didn't just find grain dust. They found starch granules that showed clear signs of malting. To make beer, you have to sprout the grain to release the sugars, then heat it to stop the growth, then mash it. The residue at Reykjavik Cave showed all those stages. This wasn't a bowl of oatmeal that accidentally went bad. This was a sophisticated multi-step brewing process, and it was happening at least 3,000 years before the first evidence of established agriculture in the region. We were brewing while we were still homeless. This discovery sent a shockwave through the world of archaeology because it flipped the traditional timeline on its head. It suggests that our desire for a drink wasn't a byproduct of civilization. It might have been the catalyst for it. Think about the sheer amount of work it takes to make beer without a kitchen or a grocery store. You have to spend days wandering the hills to find enough wild barley. You have to carry it back to a central location. You have to carve holes in solid bedrock. You have to manage the fermentation without it turning into vinegar. Why would nomadic people, who were already struggling to survive, put that much effort into a drink that doesn't even provide as much nutrition as a simple loaf of bread? The answer lies in the power of the party. The beer was a bribe for cooperation. About 600 miles north of that cave in southeastern Turkey lies a site called Göbekli Tepe. It is one of the most mysterious places on Earth. Built roughly 12,000 years ago, it consists of massive T-shaped stone pillars arranged in circles, some weighing up to 20 tons and standing 18 feet tall. These pillars are covered in intricate carvings of lions, scorpions, and vultures. This was the world's first temple, built long before the pyramids of Egypt or even the first permanent huts. For years, the lead archaeologist at the site, Klaus Schmidt, puzzled over how a group of nomadic hunter-gatherers could possibly organize the hundreds of people needed to move those stones. These people didn't have a king, a government, or a tax system. They didn't have a way to force people to work. They needed a motivator, and they found it in the bottom of a stone vat. History is written in the dregs. When Schmidt's team looked at the limestone basins found at Göbekli Tepe, some of which could hold up to 40 gallons of liquid, they found traces of calcium oxalate. In the world of archaeology, that's a smoking gun. Calcium oxalate is also known as beerstone. It's a chemical byproduct that forms on the inside of vessels used to brew or store beer. The presence of these massive vats at a site that wasn't a permanent home suggests that Göbekli Tepe was a pilgrimage site. People would gather there from miles away for massive seasonal festivals. And at those festivals, the payment for the backbreaking labor of building the temple was a massive ritualistic feast, fueled by early beer. It was the original pizza party for moving a friend's couch, except the couch weighed 20 tons, and the pizza was a thick, fermented grain porridge. Alcohol provided the social glue that allowed humans to transition from small family bands into large, coordinated groups. Bread was an afterthought. This leads us to one of the most controversial theories in archaeology, often called the beer before bread hypothesis. It was first proposed in the 1950s by an archaeologist named Robert Braidwood, and later championed by researchers like Solomon Katz and Patrick McGovern. The argument is that the first people who started domesticating wild grains weren't doing it because they were hungry. Wild grains are actually a terrible food source for hunter-gatherers. They are small, hard to harvest, and require an immense amount of processing to make them edible. If you're a prehistoric person, you're much better off spending your time hunting a deer or gathering nuts. But if those grains are the key ingredient for a drink that makes everyone in the tribe feel euphoric and connected during a ritual, suddenly that grain becomes the most valuable thing in the world. You don't farm to survive. You farm to throw a better party. The thirst drove the technology. If you look at the chemical evidence, this theory starts to look very convincing. Patrick McGovern, often called the Indiana Jones of ancient ales, has spent his career analyzing the molecular signatures left on ancient pottery. In 2004, he published findings from a Neolithic village in China called Jiahu, dating back to 7000 BCE. The jars there didn't contain just one type of alcohol. They contained a complex, extreme ferment made of rice, honey, grapes, and hawthorn berries. This wasn't a mistake. It was a recipe. It was a deliberate blend designed to achieve a specific flavor and potency. We see similar patterns at Haji Firuz Tepe in Iran, where 9,000-year-old jars show evidence of grape wine flavored with terebinth tree resin. The resin acted as a preservative, preventing the wine from turning to vinegar. Even back then, we were already using chemistry to improve our drinking experience. But this wasn't just about getting a buzz. As humans began to cluster into the first true cities in Mesopotamia and Egypt, alcohol took on a role that was far more practical than ritual. Imagine you're living in a city of 50,000 people 5,000 years ago. You don't have modern plumbing, you don't have water treatment plants. The river you use for drinking is the same river everyone else is using as a sewer. If you drink the water, you're likely to catch dysentery or cholera. But if you take that same water and turn it into beer, the boiling process kills the bacteria, and the fermentation creates an environment where most pathogens can't survive. In the ancient world, beer wasn't an indulgence. It was the only thing that was safe to drink. It was a liquid shield against disease. Beer was the currency of the gods. In ancient Sumer, the goddess of beer was named Ninkasi. We actually have a 3,800-year-old poem called the Hymn to Ninkasi that was used as a way to memorize the beer recipe for a population that couldn't read. It describes the bapir, or beer bread, being soaked, the mashing, and the final fermentation in large jars. Beer was so central to Sumerian life that it was used to pay wages. A low-level laborer might receive a liter of beer a day, while a high-ranking priest or official could get up to 5. This wasn't just about the alcohol content. Ancient beer was thick, unfiltered, and full of B vitamins and proteins from the yeast. It was liquid bread in the most literal sense. It provided the caloric fuel that built the first empires. The pyramids were built on a 4-liter-a-day habit. In Egypt, the story was the same. The workers who hauled the massive limestone blocks for the Great Pyramid of Giza weren't slaves in the way we often imagine. They were paid laborers, and we have the ration records to prove it. Each worker received a daily allowance of 2 loaves of bread and about 4 to 5 liters of beer. This wasn't the heavy 8% alcohol beer you might find at a local brewery today. It was likely a lower alcohol, nutritious brew that kept them hydrated and fed in the brutal desert sun. If the Egyptian state had run out of beer, the pyramids wouldn't have been finished. It was the logistics of brewing that allowed the logistics of empire to exist. But every gift has a price. While alcohol was building civilizations, it was also creating a strange dual existence for the human brain. On one hand, it allowed us to live in large groups, cooperate on massive projects, and survive contaminated water. On the other hand, it tapped into that 10-million-year-old drunken monkey wiring that could lead to addiction and social chaos. Ancient societies were acutely aware of this tension. The Egyptians had myths about the goddess Sekhmet, a bloodthirsty lioness who nearly destroyed humanity until the god Ra tricked her into drinking 7,000 jars of beer dyed red to look like blood. She got so drunk, she fell asleep and woke up as a gentle goddess. It was a cautionary tale. Alcohol could save you, but it could also turn you into a monster if you didn't respect it. The Romans had a different approach. By the time the Roman Empire rose to power, beer was seen as a barbarian drink, something for the Germans and Celts of the cold north. Civilized people drank wine. But the Romans didn't just drink it. They industrialized it. They created vast latifundia, or plantations dedicated solely to grapes. They developed sophisticated presses and temperature-controlled storage. They even had a goddess of the vine, Bacchus, whose festivals became so wild and disruptive that the Roman Senate actually tried to ban them in 186 BCE. It didn't work. You can't ban something that is woven into the very fabric of how a society functions. For the Romans, wine was a marker of status, a tool of diplomacy, and a way to integrate new territories into the empire. If you drank Roman wine, you were part of the Roman world. We were terraforming our own biology. This deep history explains why alcohol is the only drug that is so universally accepted and even celebrated in the modern world. It's because we grew up together. Our bodies evolved to process it. Our first religions were built around it, and our first cities were fueled by it. We didn't just discover alcohol, we co-evolved with it. It shaped our genomes and our geography. When you look at a map of the world today, you can see the alcohol belts. the regions where specific types of fermentation dictated the culture, the beer belt across northern Europe, the wine belt across the Mediterranean, and the rice wine belt across East Asia. These aren't just preferences, they are the ghosts of ancient ecological decisions. Nature doesn't care about your plans. As we moved into the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, the technology of drinking took another massive leap forward: distillation. By concentrating ethanol, we created spirits: brandy, whiskey, gin, vodka. For the first time, humans were consuming alcohol in concentrations that our 10 million-year-old enzymes weren't really designed to handle. This led to the gin craze in 18th century London and the various temperance movements that followed. We had taken a survival strategy from the forest floor and turned it into a concentrated chemical that our ancestors wouldn't have recognized. We had mastered the rotten fruit, but in doing so, we had created a whole new set of problems. The question is no longer when, but why. When we ask when ancient humans started drinking, the answer isn't a single date on a calendar. It's a series of escalating dependencies. It started 10 million years ago as a way to eat what others couldn't. It became a way to bond with the tribe 13,000 years ago. It became a way to build temples 12,000 years ago. It became a way to stay hydrated 5,000 years ago. At every step of the human journey, alcohol was there, acting as the silent partner in our progress. We didn't just stumble into the bar of history, we built the bar, we brewed the beer, and we invited the neighbors over to help us put the roof on. We are the only species that turned a toxin into a treasure. Consider the complexity of your own biology the next time you hold a drink. You have a liver that works overtime, enzymes that were forged in a Miocene food crisis, and a brain that is still looking for that specific sweet scent of a fallen mango. You are the product of 10 million years of successful hangovers. If those ancient primates hadn't reached for the bad fruit, if the Natufians hadn't spent their precious time carving stone mortars, if the Egyptians hadn't figured out how to pay an army in liquid bread, you wouldn't be here. Your history isn't just written in books. It's written in your DNA and the chemical traces on a 13,000-year-old cave floor. The bottle is a time machine. Every time we raise a glass, we are echoing a gesture that is so old it predates our ability to speak. We are reenacting the social contract of Göbekli Tepe, using a shared experience to bridge the gap between me and us. It is a beautiful, dangerous, and incredibly ancient part of what it means to be human. We didn't learn to drink because we were bored. We learned to drink because it was the only way we knew how to become who we are today. The relationship is permanent, built into the very cells of our bodies. We are the architects of our own intoxication, and we have been since the very beginning. Now, I want you to think about that specific smell from the beginning, that sweet, slightly stinging scent of fermentation. Most people see it as a sign of decay, something that has gone past its prime and should be thrown away. But for a small, struggling primate 10 million years ago, that smell was the smell of the future. It was the smell of a calorie-rich meal that would provide the energy to survive one more day, to find a mate, and to pass on those specialized enzymes to the next generation. That rot was the spark that eventually lit the fires of civilization. It's a strange thought, isn't it? That the grand achievements of our species, the cathedrals, the empires, the technology, might all be rooted in a simple search for a snack on the forest floor. But the evidence is hard to ignore. Look at those 13,000-year-old stone mortars in Israel. They aren't just holes in a rock. They are the first laboratories. They are proof that even before we knew how to stay in one place, we knew how to make something that made that place feel like home. We were willing to work for it, to plan for it, and to build our entire social lives around it. Alcohol wasn't an accident of history. It was the engine. It gave us a reason to gather, a reason to cooperate, and a reason to settle down. We didn't just start drinking alcohol. We used alcohol to start humanity. So the next time you find yourself at a gathering, watching the room relax as the drinks start to flow, take a moment to appreciate the depth of that moment. You aren't just having a beer or a glass of wine. You are participating in a 10 million-year-old survival strategy that was so successful it accidentally built the world. You are feeling the same warmth that fueled the builders of the pyramids and the pilgrims of Göbekli Tepe. It's a connection that spans the entire history of our genus, a common thread that links a modern skyscraper to a prehistoric cave. What do you think was the real motivator? Was it the nutritional safety of the brew, or was it purely the social bond it created? Does knowing the evolutionary why change how you look at our modern relationship with the bottle? I'd love to hear your thoughts on whether you think we'd have ever bothered to invent agriculture at all if it weren't for the promise of a drink at the end of the day. If you enjoy these deep dives into the weird, hidden corners of our history, consider subscribing so you don't miss our next investigation into how the smallest biological quirks created the biggest historical shifts. The story of humanity is often told through wars and kings, but perhaps it's better told through the things we did when the work was over. We think of ourselves as the masters of the world, the rational thinkers who conquered the planet through sheer intellect. But underneath all that sophistication is still that same primate, nose in the air, catching a scent on the breeze. We have spent 10,000 years refining the process, but the impulse hasn't changed a bit. We are still just looking for that fruit on the floor. Everything we've built, every city we've raised, and every law we've written can be traced back to that one specific chemical click in our ancestors' brains. We didn't just find a way to tolerate a poison, we found a way to make it the cornerstone of our existence. It's a haunting realization when you look at the sheer scale of it. Those tiny starch granules at the bottom of a cave in Reykjavik aren't just ancient trash. They are the blueprint for everything that came after. They are the definitive, haunting proof that the history of the human race didn't start with a word or a tool, but with a thirst that we are still trying to quench.